Why something inside you dies after escaping a narcissist's grip. Navigating what psychologists call the middle path in a narcissistic relationship feels less like balance and more like walking a tightrope over a canyon you never wanted to cross. It's that impossible in-between, too entangled to leave, yet too wounded to stay whole. Many people remain in this space not because they're unaware, but because life gives them no clean exit. They may be raising children with the narcissist working under them, or dealing with a family system where the narcissist is woven into the emotional infrastructure. In these situations, self-preservation stops being an abstract idea and becomes a minute-to-minute survival skill. You start scanning their face for tension, monitoring your tone, rehearsing every word before it leaves your mouth. Not to keep the peace, but to avoid the gaslighting, the explosions, and the cold, surgical way they can make you feel small. Over time, those constant emotional adjustments begin to carve into your psyche. You don't just hold your breath around them. You begin holding your truth, and even when you intellectually understand what's happening, the cost of swallowing your real self day after day becomes enormous. Before people ever understand narcissism, their shutdown looks different. It doesn't feel intentional. It feels like something happening to them. Psychologists see this often. The victim who stops responding not because they're choosing to detach, but because their nervous system has begun to numb out. Helplessness doesn't announce itself. It settles in quietly. Instead of fighting, the body freezes. Instead of speaking up, the mind goes blank. Some people erupt in chaotic bursts of anger, but most drift into silence. Therapists immediately recognize that vacant, faintly dissociated look. The look of someone still living inside the relationship but already drowning in their own self-blame. And they know what comes next. This is not just exhaustion. It is the early tremor of collapse. In clinical terms, collapse is a psychological implosion so deep that even hope has trouble finding you. And for people who don't yet understand trauma bonding or emotional abuse, collapse is not a rare outcome. It's the expected one. The complicated part is that the coping strategies used by people who cannot leave often look identical to the patterns of victims who don't yet understand what they're dealing with. Both shrink emotionally. Both withdraw to survive. Both disconnect from themselves in ways that can be mistaken as strength or taking the high road. Psychologists call this the fog of survival, a state where emotional detachment becomes so normal that you can't tell whether you're protecting yourself or disappearing. And eventually the most painful question rises. How do you pull back for safety without collapsing into the numbness that destroys you from the inside out? In emotionally abusive, dismissive, or invalidating relationships, especially when the abuse isn't physical, most people begin with fight. They argue back. They try to reason. They demand accountability. They want the truth acknowledged. But as gaslighting intensifies and trauma bonding tightens its grip, the internal landscape begins to shift. The nervous system, built to seek safety in connection, starts overriding logic. Doubt creeps in. Maybe they're right. Maybe I am overreacting. Maybe my anger is the real problem. And piece by piece, confidence begins to erode. Not because the victim is fragile, but because prolonged psychological manipulation literally reshapes how they see themselves. Then the deeper betrayal unfolds. The fight that once came from a place of self-protection turns into a survival reflex. Reactions stop coming from the authentic self and start coming from the wounded, cornered parts of the psyche. The longer someone remains in the relationship without understanding narcissism, the closer they drift toward emotional numbness, and eventually collapse. And collapse is not ordinary sadness. It is a profound emptiness, a suffocating "what's the point?" that signals the psyche is shutting down. In this state, people stop caring for their needs. They lose interest in what once mattered. Their purpose feels distant, unreachable. Psychologists describe this as psychological defeat, when emotional warfare has worn down the self to the point where even survival feels optional. This is why therapists who specialize in narcissistic abuse insist on one mission above all else: prevent collapse. Once someone collapses, getting them out is far harder because their inner world no longer has the strength to fight for its own existence. And for those who cannot leave their situation, the challenge becomes twice as difficult. They must learn to detach enough to survive, yet stay present enough not to disappear into numbness. This is the narrow emotional corridor psychologists refer to as the middle path, a place where you must protect yourself without losing yourself. And so the central question becomes, how do you actually walk this path? The answer begins, therapists say, with knowledge. You must understand how narcissistic and antagonistic relationships operate, not just externally, but psychologically. Then comes the internal work, turning that understanding inward. Many survivors wrongly label themselves as codependent or believe they somehow attract toxic people. But psychologists repeat this truth over and over. The clinginess, panic, numbness, over-explaining, and shutdown are not personality flaws. They are survival instincts. They reveal the fragmentation caused by trying to stay attached to someone who is fundamentally unsafe. What people call crazy love is not madness. It is an attachment system clinging desperately to what feels like the only available source of connection. You are not unstable. You are not dramatic. You are responding in the exact way human biology responds to emotional danger. When you finally understand the terrain, your reactions, your terror, your attachment patterns, you begin reclaiming what narcissists fight hardest to destroy, your clarity. You start to realize there was never anything broken in you. You were simply surviving an environment that was psychologically unsafe, with someone incapable of showing up in healthy, responsible, or compassionate ways. That understanding is more than insight. It is the first step back to yourself. As your awareness sharpens, when you finally begin to see the narcissistic person as they truly are rather than who they pretended to be, a deep internal shift starts unfolding. It doesn't happen all at once. It comes in waves, in realizations that land quietly at first and then echo through your entire emotional world. Therapists often call this stage the reconstruction of internal reality, because that's exactly what it is. A slow, painstaking rebuilding of your emotional and cognitive compass after years of being pulled in circles. You begin to notice an uncomfortable truth taking shape. If someone claims to love you but never protects you, never nurtures you, never honors your humanity, what they're offering isn't love at all. It's dependency dressed up as devotion, control disguised as care. And this insight doesn't just settle in your mind. It shakes something loose in your heart. Survivors often say this stage feels destabilizing because it forces them to reconcile two versions of the narcissist: the charming persona they once believed in and the harmful reality they've been living with. Therapists reassure them that this tension is normal. Your mind is trying to integrate years of contradiction, and integration takes time, patience, and gentleness with yourself. As this clarity sinks deeper, something equally important begins to happen. You stop treating yourself as the one who caused the chaos. Psychologists refer to this transformation as reclaiming the locus of responsibility. You begin to understand that the ways you reacted, whether you shut down, complied, over-explained, numbed out, or tried tirelessly to appease, were not flaws in your character. They were survival strategies. They were the body's instinctive attempts to navigate an emotional minefield. This realization can lift a tremendous weight off your shoulders, but it rarely happens alone. Clinicians emphasize that healing from narcissistic abuse is a relational process. You need people who see you clearly, who hold space for your story without minimizing it, who help stabilize your overwhelmed nervous system. For many survivors, this is the hardest step because isolation has often been part of the abuse. Years of emotional exhaustion and eroded self-worth may have strained friendships or prevented new ones from forming. Many feel embarrassed to reach out, and yet, psychologists stress that emotional repair cannot happen in isolation. You cannot rebuild trust or attachment in the echo chamber of your own mind. Healing requires human connection. For survivors who cannot fully cut contact with the narcissist, psychologists shift from talking about recovery to teaching resilience. They offer tools grounded in both neuroscience and clinical experience, because when you have no choice but to interact with someone who harms you, preparation becomes a form of armor. Think of these interactions as preparing for bad weather. You don't walk into a storm unprotected, and you shouldn't walk into a conversation with a narcissist unprepared. Taking a few grounding breaths before engaging helps steady your nervous system. Therapists often repeat one crucial guideline: don't go deep, don't defend, don't explain, don't personalize their accusations or barbs. Depth feeds the narcissist's need for superiority. Instead, emotional detachment becomes a lifeline, not because you've become cold, but because conserving your psychological energy is essential to survival. Another key strategy is reconnecting with the real reason you remain in contact. Psychologists call this reframing, reminding yourself that the interaction isn't about emotional connection, but necessity. Maybe you are co-parenting and need to be the stable parent for your children. Maybe the narcissist is tied to family relationships you still cherish. Maybe your career depends on navigating a toxic workplace for a little longer. When survivors anchor themselves to the larger purpose, the narcissist's voice loses some of its power. The emotional center shifts back to you. And after the interaction is over, what therapists call the back end, self-care becomes non-negotiable. Encounters with narcissists drain emotional resources at a shocking speed. Psychologists compare it to running an emotional marathon without training. Feeling exhausted, irritable, sad, or numb afterward is not a sign of weakness. It's a physiological response to psychological strain. That is why therapists teach survivors to build restorative rituals into their lives. Quiet rest, gentle movement, time outdoors, meaningful conversation, calming routines, or even small, grounding moments of solitude. These acts help the nervous system return to baseline, preventing the exhaustion from hardening into numbness or collapse. They remind survivors that narcissistic interactions are not their normal. They are emotional hazards that require recovery time. This matters deeply because psychologists warn of a subtle but devastating trap: normalization. When survivors interact repeatedly with narcissists without mindful recovery or clear perspective, they begin to absorb the dysfunction as if it is simply part of life. Self-blame creeps back in, emotional numbness spreads, and the collapse that clinicians call psychic withdrawal becomes more likely. To counter this, survivors must maintain a realistic picture of the relationship. Radical acceptance that narcissistic individuals rarely change is essential. A coherent personal narrative, one that acknowledges the harm truthfully, keeps the survivor grounded. Supportive relationships keep them connected. Self-care keeps their emotional core steady. When these elements combine, survivors can resist the gravitational pullback toward collapse. Walking this path is no small task. Interacting with a narcissist while trying to stay whole is one of the most emotionally difficult challenges a person can face. Psychologists emphasize that exhaustion, overwhelm, or temporary instability after these encounters are not signs of personal weakness. They are evidence of how taxing the dynamic truly is. Yet awareness, boundaries, preparation, connection, and compassionate self-care function like a protective shield. They create space for breath, space for clarity, space where collapse does not get the final word, and where healing becomes possible even in the midst of ongoing harm. This is one of the many middle paths survivors must walk. Paths that honor the truth, protect the psyche, and preserve the self. I hope you continue walking yours with clarity, kindness toward yourself, and the unshakable knowledge that your struggle is not a sign of brokenness. It is proof of your strength.